Thought we'd take a look at the Sony Alpha A700 DSLR. Done quite a few A-mount camera reviews, but this was something which I wanted to take a closer look at. This model was the successor to the 7D, which was the first DSLR which Minolta brought out. And it offers some substantial upgrades in many areas, particularly in terms of the resolution. They've put the main program dial over on the left hand side, and you'll notice we do have an MR or memory recall setting. That's a slightly different take compared to the 7D, which had separate banks. Still using the inverted Minolta hot shoe. On the right hand side we have 4 larger oversized buttons. On the back, quite a few controls. This panel is plastic, but the top and front covers are magnesium alloy, so it feels quite sturdy. Got those sensors at the viewfinder, so it will switch off the display. Compared to the 7D, they've replaced the directional pad with a joystick. The overall layout is quite similar though. I'll give you some comparisons a bit later on. Plenty of buttons and switches with this camera. We have metering control around the exposure lock button. This was quite a substantial upgrade in terms of the overall design compared to the first release that Sony did, the A100. You also get additional connections. You have the flash sync port, remote DC input, there is an HDMI and a video out. Onto the front of the camera we do have that additional ring around the mount. I'm not sure why Sony did that, but it perhaps strengthens it. There is a switch for single, continuous, manual focus and automatic modes, depth of field preview button. There's a red autofocus assist LED, which has the same pattern as the Minolta ones did back in the day, so a dedicated AF assist lamp. Many people would prefer that to using the flash. It does feel substantial, but it's not too heavy, it's under 700 grams. With the flash you just lift it up, there's no auto mechanism with this. And it does support wireless as well as manual flash control. We have 2 card slots, but unfortunately there's no overflow or automatic backup with them. You can only use one of them at a time. I suppose you can at least keep a spare with the memory stick one, and you can get adapters for micro SD these days. I'll just show you the base of the camera. We're still using the FM500H battery. You also have grip contacts in there. I'll just show you the grip quickly, and this is also quite nicely made. It is mostly metal or magnesium. I do like the fact they did provide a grip with this, but I do prefer the normal grip without the stem sticking up. It just makes it easier to store and carry it around. And it's not too big, unlike some of the later grips that Sony did, which were really quite massive. This one isn't. It's a decent size for the camera. You'll see there's a rubber pad on the top of the door, so there is some weather sealing with this. And this will take 2 of those batteries, which will double your capacity. You could be looking at around about 1300 shots. In reality, you're going to get quite a few more than that if you don't use the flash. We're using a glass pentaprism viewfinder, so the view is somewhat larger than the smaller pentamirror ones on the cheaper cameras. Unfortunately, there's no full-time ISO display, but you do get some information if you press the ISO button. That center focus point is a double cross like the Minolta 7 film camera. There's a nice feature with this camera. You can use the quick nav function. You can just scroll around and pick the setting that you want to change and then just change it without going into the menu system. As far as the main menus go, it's very similar to the other Sony cameras that I've looked at. You can also link the spot metering to the AEL button. But it is worth pointing out there is no AF fine tune on this camera. Not many cameras did have that, but they were starting to come in at this time. Compared to the A100, you have an RGB histogram. But unfortunately, there is no live view on this camera. That's something which is missing. They did, however, include the smaller and large displays. Let's have a listen to the shutter mechanism. It's a less distracting shutter sound compared to the A100, which was quite clunky. Fairly decent buffer on this camera. Let's look at the image quality now, the low light performance. There's some improvements with the CMOS sensor. Certainly be happy using this at 1600 or even 3200 ISO. Things do take a bit of a dive though by the time you get up to 6400. That's one of their expanded settings. It's quite noisy. But Sony are also applying noise reduction to the RAW files if you put the noise reduction setting on. That affects both the JPEG and the RAW output. Originally when the camera was released you couldn't bypass the noise reduction on the RAW, but they did bring out a firmware update which lets you turn it off. I personally think you're much better off shooting RAW. You do see some loss of saturation with the JPEGs at high ISO. Sony have included their dynamic range optimizer. This will help lift the shadows, and you have manual controls and 5 settings for that if you wish to use that. If you're taking pictures of people, be careful with the higher settings because it can cause some issues with skin tones. As far as the metering goes, that's a similar system to the A100, and it works pretty well in many cases. Like this wide angle shot with snow, that might have underexposed with some cameras, but I did find sometimes you get a bit of underexposure with telephoto shots in particular. You can always use the exposure compensation, or in this case I switched over to spot metering. If you're in high contrast situations, I'd also recommend that you perhaps dial down the exposures, particularly for landscape shots. I found sometimes I wanted to adjust it down a little bit. Do remember the multi-segment metering does bias towards the focus point, so that will affect the metering overall. And the range out of this camera is pretty good. There's a decent amount to pull back in the shadows. Not as good as modern cameras, but it's maybe around about 3 stops or a little bit more than that you can get without any serious problems with noise. As far as the highlights go, I'm not sure there's much difference between this and the A100, to be honest. Of course, you'll be able to get much better results shooting RAW with the highlight recovery. Sony do have a version of the zone matching system, which is very similar to what we saw on the A100 and 5D. And that will also work with RAW files. So if you're running into problems, it's worth looking into that setting. That does help quite a bit. Give you a few thoughts now when I'm showing you some sample images. Camera performance was pretty decent in most regards. I found the focus to be quite good. Certainly a nice improvement over the A100. It's snappier to focus and the tracking is improved. There's no question the images are better in low light. That was a weak point on the A100. It really wasn't very usable above ISO 800. Do remember that the ISO settings do vary on these cameras even with the same maker. You'd have to shoot them side by side to see how much of a difference there is in low light. The handling is another key feature with the ergonomics and the controls. You have many more controls on the camera, so you may find it a more enjoyable experience using the A700. Let's talk about a few areas that I think could have been better. Sony decided to go with just a single mode dial, so that means to say we've got this sort of empty space on the top plate. They've made the buttons bigger, but there's sort of like a gap there where you think there should be something and there isn't. The back of the camera is very similar to the 7D in many ways. There's a couple of differences with the joystick. The advantage with the twin dials on top is you can have the drive mode as well on the main program dial, and that is very handy. It's open to debate, but I think the 7D is a better design overall. Sony did add a top LCD display with the A900, which I'm showing you here. The depth of field preview button is very awkward to press, partly because it's just straight. It should be angled really. What I find happens is if you want to use that button, you end up using the nail on your small finger. In other regions, the camera had a nickel-plated metal grip sensor. This was used for the iStar AF. But on the European version, it's just black plastic dummy. It doesn't do anything, and that means the iStar AF is not particularly useful. Some people have had issues with the control dials, the front and rear ones. It's not limited to the A700. There's a few other models from Sony which seem to have had some problems. I also saw this on the A99. Sometimes the dials are not responsive. The LCD is quite good in terms of resolution, but the coating on it is not particularly anti-reflective and it's quite easy to mark and smudge. And there are also a fair few complaints about back focusing too with the A700. The one I have here is pretty good. It's not hugely off, but it's not as well calibrated as my 5Ds. There's no AF fine tune, so if you've got any problems, you might have to have a look at that with a DIY fix. I like it overall. It doesn't match the Film 7 in my view for the autofocus performance. It's decent performance, but it's just not as responsive and as fast as that camera. But it is a solid upgrade over the 7D. Gone from 6 to 12 megapixels. It's a much more up-to-date camera compared to the older one. Would have liked to have seen a Mark II version of this camera, perhaps with the 16 megapixel sensor. Be interested to hear if you still got one of these cameras, or perhaps you've used one in the past. Hope you found that video useful, and thanks for watching.